It was a routine night in a quiet neighborhood until a shocking turn of events unfolded, leaving everyone in disbelief. Police, responding to a call about a suspicious man, had no idea who they were about to encounter. What started as a routine stop quickly escalated, with officers opening fire on a black man's son in what seemed like an instant. The officers believed they were facing a dangerous suspect, but when the smoke cleared and the man's true identity was revealed, the world would learn that this wasn't just any ordinary person. They had just confronted a retired Delta Force commander. How did this happen? What went wrong? And how did a highly trained military veteran end up caught in a deadly misunderstanding with law enforcement? As details about the incident emerge, it becomes clear that this story is about much more than just a case of mistaken identity. It's about the miscommunication, the tension, and the risks that both sides face in these high-stakes situations. Stay with us as we dive deeper into this jaw-dropping story, revealing what really happened that night and how the truth came to light. What happens next might just change the way we think about justice and security. To understand how such a tragic misunderstanding could happen, we need to look at the man at the center of this shocking incident, James Walker. A retired Delta Force commander, Walker had served his country for over 2 decades. His years of elite training made him one of the best in his field, but they also meant that he had a highly developed sense of situational awareness. He knew how to handle himself in extreme situations, and he knew what it was like to be in dangerous environments. But tonight, none of that training prepared him for what was about to unfold in his own neighborhood. James had retired several years ago, leaving the intense world of covert operations behind. He'd settled into a quiet life with his family, hoping for peace after the chaos of military service. However, the shadows of his past still followed him, especially when it came to his son Malik. Malik was no stranger to the stories of his father's service, but as a young man of his generation, he struggled with the heavy expectations placed upon him. Malik's life had always been a balancing act between honoring his father's legacy and carving out his own path. That evening, as Malik was walking down the street near their home, the tension between the police and local residents was already high. There had been several reports of disturbances in the area, an uptick in crime, and rumors about dangerous individuals. The officers, already on edge, didn't hesitate when they saw Malik. To them, he seemed like just another suspect. His appearance, his mannerisms, and his movements set off alarms. They had no idea that the man they were about to confront was connected to someone who had served at the highest levels of military strategy. As the officers approached, Malik felt the surge of adrenaline kick in. Something wasn't right. As the officers closed in, Malik's mind raced. He didn't know why they were approaching him so quickly, but something in the air felt off. The way they moved, the sharpness in their voices, the way they instantly put their hands near their holsters, it all screamed danger. Malik, never one to back down from confrontation, instinctively raised his hands to show he wasn't armed, but it only seemed to make the officers more nervous. "Get on the ground," one of the officers shouted, his voice rough with authority. Malik hesitated. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't even sure why they were stopping him. But the tension in the air was thick, and every second felt like it could turn into something violent. From his vantage point, a few houses down, James Walker had seen the whole scene unfold. His gut dropped as he recognized his son's face, his heart pounding in his chest. Without thinking, he rushed outside, instinctively drawing from the years of military discipline that had once made him an unstoppable force. But this wasn't combat. This wasn't a mission in a foreign land. This was his neighborhood, his family, and he could see things spiraling out of control. "Malik," he shouted, his voice breaking the silence as he ran toward the scene. He wasn't sure if the officers even heard him. The situation was escalating far too quickly. He was too far away to stop them, but the training inside him told him that he had to act fast. He couldn't let Malik get hurt. To the officers, though, James' sudden appearance only made things worse. They didn't know who this man was, but the sight of a figure rushing toward them triggered the worst instincts. The commanding officer shouted another order: Get down, now. James froze. For a split second, all he could think of was his family. The training kicked in, telling him to assess and stay calm, but his heart raced as the voices of his old commanders echoed in his mind. Always trust your instincts, But did his instincts now make him a target too? The situation had gone from a misunderstanding to something much more dangerous. The officers, on high alert, couldn't tell whether James was coming to defend Malik or if he was a potential threat himself. Each move felt like it could push them closer to a deadly mistake. And all the while, Malik was standing there, unsure of how to de-escalate. He could see his father approaching, but the fear in the officer's eyes only made the moment feel like it was about to explode into violence. His heart raced, his palms sweaty. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about his family, his father's past, and a system that was starting to show its cracks. But neither side could stop the inevitable momentum. And in the distance, the sound of sirens growing louder only added to the mounting tension. What would happen next? Would the truth come out in time to prevent a disaster? The tension was unbearable. Malik stood frozen, unsure of what would happen next. The officers were shouting commands, their hands tight on their weapons. One of them pointed his gun straight at James, who had now closed the distance, moving swiftly, with a calmness that only someone with his level of training could possess. The officer's eyes were wild with panic, that every muscle tensed. One wrong move from James, and it could all go terribly wrong. Get back. One officer screamed, his voice trembling as he aimed his weapon at James. The fear in his eyes was palpable, but it only made him more dangerous. James didn't flinch, didn't step back. He couldn't. His son was in danger, and he knew he had to do something, anything, to stop this from spiraling further. "Officer, stop. He's my son," James shouted, his voice carrying through the night air. But his words seemed to have no effect on the officers, who were clearly in fight-or-flight mode. The sirens were growing louder, adding another layer of chaos to the already volatile scene. More squad cars were arriving, the lights flashing like an eerie strobe, casting long shadows on the street. The officers' eyes darted between James and Malik, unsure of what to do next. They were out of their depth. In their minds, there was only one option: protect themselves at all costs. James was just a few feet away now. Sweat trickled down his forehead as he assessed the situation, trying to figure out how to defuse it. He could feel his old instincts kicking in, years of combat experience, years of reading the smallest details in a split second. But he also knew that his next move could be the one that determined everything. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. One wrong word, one wrong step, and it could all spiral into violence. Malik, on the other hand, was fighting the rising panic in his chest. He saw the fear in his father's eyes, but he also knew the truth. James Walker wasn't just any man. He was a man who had faced down death countless times, a man who had trained for situations like this. But what good would his skills be if the officers were already seeing him as a threat? "Please," Malik murmured, barely audible, trying to reach out to the officers with his voice. "We're not the enemy." But his words seemed to be drowned out by the increasing noise, the sirens, the shouting, the commands, the urgency building in the air. It felt like a storm was about to break, and the worst part was that no one knew exactly what it was going to take to stop it. And then it happened. The sound of a gunshot shattered the silence. It wasn't clear who fired first, but the crack of the bullet reverberated through the street. The officers froze, as if the world itself had paused. Every single person on the scene was now holding their breath, waiting for the next move. James felt a surge of adrenaline, but it was too late to stop it. The chaos had already been set in motion, and all he could do now was pray that no one else would be caught in the crossfire. But in that brief moment of stillness, one thing was certain: the stakes had just been raised, and the outcome of this standoff would have consequences that none of them could foresee. The sound of the gunshot still echoed in the night, but there was no movement from anyone. No one dared to make the next move. Everyone was waiting, frozen in that split second between life and death. James could feel his heart hammering in his chest as he stared down the barrel of a weapon, sweat pouring down his face. He didn't know who had fired, or why, but he knew one thing. This situation was about to take an irreversible turn. The officers were still locked in place, their hands trembling on their weapons. But then, just as the tension seemed unbearable, a second, much sharper sound pierced the night. A car screeched to a halt at the end of the street, its headlights cutting through the dark. The officers instantly shifted their attention, their eyes darting toward the new arrival. But it wasn't another patrol car. Out of the vehicle stepped a man in a tactical vest, someone who clearly wasn't a part of the local police force. He was well-built, his presence commanding, and his eyes scanned the scene with an unnerving calmness. As he approached, the officers hesitated, confused. He wasn't part of their team, and they had no idea who he was, but something in the way he moved made them uneasy. James felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He knew exactly who this man was. Someone from his past. Someone who had once been part of his covert operations team. But why was he here, in this small, quiet neighborhood at this moment? Before James could process what was happening, the man walked directly toward him, his gaze never leaving James's face. "James Walker," the man said, his voice low and steady, but with a dangerous undertone. "You've been compromised." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. Compromised? He hadn't even had time to think about what was happening to him in the moment. But now he realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding with the police. It wasn't just an accident. This was something much bigger, something that someone had orchestrated from the shadows. The officers, now equally confused and on edge, exchanged glances. They were caught in the middle of a situation that had quickly spiraled out of their control, and now this stranger, this potential threat, was making things even more complicated. Malik, still in shock from everything happening so fast, tried to make sense of it all. He looked between his father and the man in the tactical gear. "Who is he?" Malik whispered, his voice shaking. James couldn't take his eyes off the man, trying to gauge his intentions. He knew too well how quickly things could go wrong in these high-stakes situations. Was this man here to help, or had the target shifted from Malik to him? The mysterious man's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer to James. "I'm not here to explain," he said, voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "We need to leave. Now." And before James could respond, the flash of lights from yet another car appeared, brighter than ever before, but this time, something felt different. The air was thick with the promise of more danger. The mystery of what had just unfolded, and why it was all happening tonight, was far from over. The man in the tactical vest didn't wait for a response. He grabbed James by the arm and pulled him toward the edge of the street. "We need to move," he said, urgency in his voice now. "You don't understand. This is bigger than you think." James struggled to process it all. His military instincts told him that something far more dangerous than a routine police stop was unfolding, but he couldn't piece together the puzzle in real time. Malik, still standing in shock, watched his father being dragged away, his pulse racing. "What's going on, Dad?" he shouted, panic in his voice. The man with the vest turned his head briefly. "We're in danger, kid. Your father's past is catching up with him." James shot a quick look at Malik before being pulled into the shadows. His eyes were wide, trying to make sense of the words. He'd done everything to leave that life behind, but now it seemed like his past was right here on the streets, knocking at his door. As the mysterious man led James behind an abandoned building, the flash of police lights grew dimmer in the distance. The officers' confusion, still evident on their faces, left the tension lingering in the air. But that wasn't what worried James. What worried him was that now, for the first time in years, someone from his past was directly threatening his family. "Who sent you?" James demanded, his voice harsh as he twisted his arm out of the man's grasp. The man's expression hardened, his jaw clenched. "You really don't know, do you?" he said. This wasn't just a coincidence. You've been followed, watched for a long time. They didn't forget about you, James. A wave of realization hit James like a tidal wave. He had assumed the worst was behind him, that the shadowy world of covert ops, of enemies and betrayals, was just that, in the past. But now the truth was clear. Someone from his past had set this entire thing in motion, using his own son as a pawn. The thought made his blood run cold. Who are they? He asked, his voice low and threatening. The man hesitated, but his lips slowly parted. They call themselves the Vanguard.